It was a grey morning along the Seine, the kind that pressed a damp hand over Paris and seemed to blur the edges of every street lamp and rooftop. At the Quai des Orfèvres, where the air smelled faintly of pipe smoke and wet stone, Chief Inspector Maigret leaned against the window frame of his office. Below, the barges moved sluggishly on the river, their horns echoing with a melancholy note. News had arrived from a provincial town. A man long thought dead, buried with ceremony in a churchyard, had been seen walking out of a café as though he had merely stepped away from his own wake. The telegram bore the weight of rumour, but the ink was official enough. It spoke of something impossible, scandalous, perhaps criminal. In the quiet of his office, Maigret drew deeply on his pipe and let the smoke curl toward the ceiling, his expression unreadable, as if the absurdity of the thing amused him and disturbed him in equal measure. And so begins the tale of a funeral without a corpse, of papers signed in haste, of women in black veils who may have wept for the wrong man. It begins here, where Paris presses its secrets into the fog, and Maigret must decide whether to descend into another man's grave or to follow the footsteps of one who returned from it. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn into this mystery, I invite you to remain with us through each chapter of this unfolding case. Subscribe, share, and lend your ear to the echoes of the Seine, for the shadows grow deeper with each passing page. It arrived just after dawn, when the Quai des Orfèvres was still half asleep, its corridors echoing only with the hollow tread of the night guard making his final rounds. A clerk with pale hands and ink stains along his cuffs brought the folded sheet to Maigret's office, where the inspector sat in his shirt sleeves, the window cracked open to the damp air. Outside, the city was wrapped in fog. The Seine carried a film of mist along its surface, and the barges moored against the quay groaned softly, as if restless in their chains. Maigret did not immediately open the telegram. He sat with his pipe cupped in one palm, staring at the slow curl of smoke as though it contained the answer to all things, before he even asked the question. He could feel the weight of the paper, stiff and official, yet trembling faintly in the clerk's nervous hand. When at last he slid a thumb under the fold and flattened the sheet against his desk, his eyes moved without haste across the words. The message was brief, mechanical in tone, yet the content was absurd enough to stir even the most weary of policemen. It spoke of a man named François Coudray, deceased these 2 years, buried with priest and pallbearers in the provincial town of Saint-Aubin. And yet, the telegram claimed, witnesses swore he had walked out of a café near the railway station only the day before, his coat collar turned up against the rain, his gait unmistakable. Alive. For a long time, Maigret did not stir. He let the weight of the absurdity settle upon him, as though testing whether it would collapse under its own improbability. A man risen from his grave, as if Paris had suddenly turned into some cheap feuilleton. But the telegram was signed by the local commissaire, whose name Maigret knew well enough, an unimaginative fellow, not the sort to indulge in village gossip. The inspector rose at last, tamped down the ash in his pipe, and crossed to the window. The fog pressed against the glass, blurring the outline of the opposite quay. Somewhere below, a barge horn sounded, low and mournful. He thought of Saint-Aubin, with its sloping streets, its narrow churchyard, where the moss crawled over tilted stones. He had passed through the town once, years ago, on his way to a case farther west. The air there had smelled of cider and damp earth, and the people had stared at strangers as though they had wandered into a private drama. When Lucas arrived with a file tucked under his arm, Maigret merely nodded at the telegram and let the younger man read. Lucas frowned, then allowed himself a short, disbelieving laugh. "A ghost, patron?" he said. "Or a mistake," Maigret replied evenly, though his eyes did not leave the fog outside. "Or something worse." He thought of the widow, for there must have been one. Some woman who had dressed herself in black, who had wept into a handkerchief as the coffin was lowered into the ground. What would it mean if her tears had been shed for a lie? Or if the man himself had watched, hidden among the gravestones, as his neighbours mourned him? The office clock ticked with its usual indifference. Maigret poured himself a cup of coffee gone cold and drank it without grimace. He could feel the case pressing against him already, not with the sharp urgency of violence, but with a slow, insinuating chill of something out of joint. Death, after all, was supposed to be final. When it was not, the world slipped sideways. By mid-morning, the news had drawn the others as surely as smoke draws eyes. Janvier leaned against the door-frame with his easy grin, while Torrance thumbed his suspenders and shook his head. Each man had a theory, none worth repeating. Maigret listened, his broad shoulders slouched, his eyelids heavy, as though the discussion were happening in some cafe where he was no more than a customer at the next table. But behind that apparent indifference, he was measuring the cadence of their voices, the slight tremor of unease in their laughter. Even policemen, hardened by years of corpses and confessions, felt the disquiet of the unnatural. By noon, he had decided. A note was sent to Madame Maigret, telling her not to wait for him at supper. He imagined her nodding silently as she folded the note, accustomed by now to sudden absences. She would set aside his plate all the same, perhaps let the stew cool on the stove until the hour grew too late. The journey south took him by train, the compartment smelling of damp wool and coal smoke. Raindrops streaked the window, cutting crooked lines through the mist. Across from him, a farmer dozed with his hat pulled low, while a young woman leafed through a newspaper without really reading. Maigret sat motionless, his pipe unlit, his gaze fixed on the rolling fields that emerged and vanished in the fog. He thought of the telegram folded in his pocket, its words plain yet unbelievable, and of the man it claimed had walked out of his own funeral. In Saint-Aubin, the station clock showed 3 in the afternoon. The town was as he remembered, stone houses pressed close together, shutters half closed against the drizzle, the air smelling of damp straw. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, then fell silent. The commissaire awaited him at the platform, a small man with a nervous moustache who removed his hat repeatedly as he spoke. "Inspector, I sent the telegram because the witnesses were insistent. 2 of them respectable men, both swore it was François Coudray. They knew him since childhood. They say he ordered a drink at the café, left coins on the table, and walked toward the square. No one has seen him since." Maigret listened, his heavy features betraying nothing. He asked about the funeral, the death certificate, the coffin. The commissaire assured him all had been in order. The doctor had signed the papers. The priest had said the Mass. The grave had been filled. There were dozens who had seen it. And yet, here they were. As they walked toward the commissariat, Maigret let his eyes roam over the town. He noted the pattern of cobblestone slick with rain, the dark mouths of alleys, the curtained windows behind which shadows moved. Everywhere he felt the faint prickle of curiosity. Already the rumour had spread. Faces appeared at corners, disappeared again, as though the entire town held its breath. That evening, Maigret sat alone in the small inn where he had taken a room. The lamp on the table flickered, its kerosene scent mixing with the stew placed before him. He ate slowly, without appetite, while the murmur of voices drifted from the common room. They were speaking of Coudray, he was certain. They were weighing the impossible against the ordinary, as villagers always did when confronted with something that unsettled their quiet routines. Maigret lit his pipe at last and leaned back, the smoke curling upward in the dim light. He felt the case settling around him, heavy yet intangible, like fog pressing against a window pane. A man said to be dead had walked again among the living. Either the village had buried the wrong body, or someone had decided to erase himself and step back into the world only when it suited him. Or else, perhaps, the world had gone mad. But Maigret did not believe in madness. He believed in people, in their stubborn motives, their small deceits, their tangled desires. Somewhere behind the telegram, behind the whispers in the square, there was a truth as solid as the stones of Saint-Aubin. And it was his task to find it. He exhaled a long plume of smoke, watched it dissolve into the shadows, and thought of the widow he had not yet met. Somewhere in this town, a woman had lived 2 years in mourning. Tomorrow he would see the expression in her eyes when he spoke her husband's name. For tonight he allowed the mystery to settle like the fog outside. The clock struck 10, the innkeeper bolted the door, and Maigret remained a silent figure behind the curtain of smoke, waiting for the morning to draw him deeper into the grave of a man who would not stay buried. The morning broke in Saint-Aubin with a drizzle that hung over the streets like a curtain, soft enough not to be called rain, yet heavy enough to leave damp traces on the cobblestones. Maigret stepped into the square with his coat collar turned up, his hat pulled low against the mist. The town was awake in its modest way, shop shutters lifting one by one, a horse clopping past with cartwheels rattling, children in short coats being tugged by mothers toward the schoolyard gate. But everywhere he went, Maigret felt eyes turning toward him, sliding away again, like curtains quickly drawn. The commissaire had warned him that the rumor of François Coudray's return had taken hold. No one would say it aloud, but the story travelled swiftly in the clatter of cups at the café, in the hush of women at the baker's counter. He walked the short distance to a narrow street lined with houses pressed close together, their plaster walls streaked with damp. The widow lived there, in a modest dwelling with faded shutters and a geranium pot that clung stubbornly to the window ledge despite the season. The commissaire had offered to accompany him, but Maigret had refused. He preferred to meet her alone. Too many uniforms had a way of making grief defensive. He knocked once, firmly, and waited. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s, her black dress plain but neat, her hair pinned in a way that suggested care more than vanity. She looked at him without surprise, as though she had known since yesterday that the inspector from Paris would come knocking. Her eyes were not red from weeping, nor hardened with bitterness. They were calm, reserved, and perhaps a little watchful, as if weighing how much truth she would allow herself to reveal. "Madame Coudray," Maigret said, inclining his head slightly. She stepped back without a word, letting him enter. The house smelled of boiled coffee and wood smoke. A crucifix hung above the mantel, and on a sideboard stood a photograph in a dark frame, a man in a stiff collar, unsmiling, his gaze straight at the camera. François Coudray, Maigret presumed. The man who was said to have died. They sat opposite each other at a small wooden table. She poured coffee without asking if he wanted any. The gesture was automatic, almost hospitable, but her hands were steady as she set the cup before him. "You've heard the talk," she said at last, her voice low but even. Maigret drew on his pipe, letting the silence linger until the smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling. "Yes, I've heard." "They say they've seen him," she continued, her eyes not leaving his. "They say he walked into the cafe as if nothing had happened, that he drank a glass, paid for it, and left. And now they say—" "What? That I buried another man, that I am a fool or worse, That I am a liar?" Her tone was controlled, but beneath it, Maigret detected the iron edge of long-held dignity, the kind that would not easily bend to gossip. "You were his wife," Maigret said simply. "You stood by his grave." She nodded once, sharply. "I did. 2 years ago on a cold day in November. I remember the smell of the earth, damp and heavy. I remember the sound of the priest's voice. I remember people touching my shoulder, whispering condolences, and I remember watching the coffin lowered, knowing my husband was inside it." Her words carried the force of someone who had replayed the scene countless times, as though repeating it could keep doubt at bay. Yet Maigret, listening, could not shake the impression that she spoke almost too clearly, as if determined to ward off any suggestion that her memory might falter. "You identified the body yourself?" Her hands tightened slightly around the coffee cup. "I did. They found him in a barn outside town. He had been working with timber, they said, when a beam fell. His face was not easy to look at, but it was him, his clothes, his hands, the scar on his wrist. I knew it was François." The inspector said nothing. He let the crackle of the small fire fill the space between them. Outside, a cart rolled past, the horse's hooves muffled by the wet street. He watched her carefully, weighing her words, not only for their meaning, but for their silences. "And now," she added, almost as if to herself, "they want me to believe that he lives, that he abandoned me, that he hid himself away only to stroll back into town for a drink. Do you know what that means for me, Inspector? Do you know what they whisper?" Maigret's gaze softened, but his voice remained steady. "I can imagine." "That I was paid for the insurance," she said bitterly. "That I conspired in the lie. That I lived these 2 years in comfort while my husband was hiding like a thief. They will never say it to my face, but the looks, they say enough." She lowered her eyes then, the first crack in her composure, and for a moment the inspector thought she might weep. But no tears came. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and drew in a breath. Maigret let his pipe go out, setting it aside. "Madame, I do not come here to judge you. I come because there is truth to be found, and truth is never as simple as rumor makes it. You believe he is dead." Her eyes lifted to his again, calm once more. "I know he is dead." Maigret rose, his heavy frame casting a shadow across the small room. He walked to the sideboard and studied the photograph. The man's features were plain, unremarkable, the sort of face that could belong to 1,000 men in France. Yet the longer he looked, the more he wondered what others had seen in it, a husband, a neighbor, a drinking companion, and whether that same face could now walk the streets without a tremor of recognition. When he turned back, the widow was watching him closely. For the first time he felt the faintest flicker of unease, not because of her words, but because of her certainty. "Thank you, madame," he said at last. "I may return with more questions." She inclined her head, and he left her sitting at the table, hands folded, as though she had been carved from stone. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into a steady rain. Maigret walked slowly, the brim of his hat dripping, his shoulders hunched. He thought of the widow's composure, of her careful insistence that she had buried her husband. If she were lying, she lied with conviction. If she spoke the truth, then the town's rumor had made her a prisoner in her own house. At the corner café, he stopped for a glass of white wine. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke, the tables crowded with men in work coats. Conversation dipped when he entered, then resumed in lowered tones. He felt the eyes upon him again, weighing, speculating. On the wall hung a calendar turned to October, its bright picture at odds with the grey outside. The innkeeper leaned toward him as he set down the glass. "They say you've spoken to her?" he murmured. "The widow? What did she tell you?" Maigret looked at him steadily, letting the silence answer. The innkeeper shifted uneasily, as if realizing he had said too much. Later, as he stepped back into the rain, Maigret drew a long breath. He could feel the case tightening around him, like the fog that crept through the alleys. The widow's certainty, the villagers' whispers, the commissaire's cautious reports, all were threads in a fabric he could not yet see. Somewhere between the grave and the café stood the truth. And as he lit his pipe beneath a dripping eave, Maigret thought again of the photograph on the widow's sideboard, of the eyes that stared straight into the lens. A man who had once been alive, once buried, and perhaps now walked again. Tomorrow, Maigret would go to the churchyard and stand before the grave itself. Only the earth could tell him whether it held what it claimed. The churchyard lay on the slope behind Saint-Aubin, a scatter of crooked stones and iron crosses leaning like tired men after a long day. A low wall of rough masonry held back the fields, and the gate creaked with the damp as Maigret pushed it open. The rain had softened to a mist that beaded on his coat and gathered at the brim of his hat. From the belfry, a bell sounded the quarter hour with a reluctant clang, as if unsure that time should be kept in such weather. He paused a moment at the threshold and drew on his pipe, letting the smell of damp earth mix with tobacco. Graves have a way of telling their own story, but only to those willing to wait for the whisper. He found the grave easily enough. A simple wooden cross stood at the head, weathered to grey, the name burned into it with a hot iron, so the letters had sunk unevenly in the grain. François Coudray. Below, the year of death had been scored in with a blunt nail, making the numbers crude and uncertain. Someone had planted a few stiff chrysanthemums that now bowed under the moisture, their petals browned at the edges. The mound was low, settled, but a patch near the foot seemed a shade darker than the rest, as if the ground there drank more greedily than its neighbours. Maigret lowered himself, the knees of his trousers taking a damp mark, and pinched a little of the soil between his fingers. It clung heavy with recent water, yet beneath it the texture shifted, looser somehow, as if turned more recently than 2 years would warrant. A cough sounded behind him, the polite announcement of a man too respectful to intrude and too curious to stay away. Maigret rose and turned to find the sexton watching him from beneath a cap coated with fine rain. He was a narrow fellow, with the stoop of those who have spent a lifetime bending to their work. His boots were thick with clay, and he held an iron key in one hand as though it alone gave him standing in this kingdom of the dead. "You're from Paris," the sexton said, not a question, not quite a welcome. "Maigret," the inspector answered. "You dug this one?" "I dig them all," the man said, "and fill them too. It's work, not glory." His eyes slid toward the cross. "There's much talk." "There is." Maigret's gaze returned to the earth. "Do you keep records?" The sexton nodded toward the chapel. "In a book, in the sacristy. I write what the priest tells me to write. Date of burial, plot. I'm no clerk." Inside the small chapel, the air smelled of wax and cold stone. The sexton set the big key down with care and brought out a ledger whose pages were thick as cardboard, the corners rounded from years of handling. He licked a finger, turned to the autumn 2 years past, and indicated a line with his nail. There it was, Coudray, François, buried 12th November. Plot D17. Priest Lenoir. Cause of death, accident at timber yard as per doctor's certificate. D17, the sexton repeated. as if the numbers themselves should be sufficient to end all argument. "I remember because it rained the night we lowered him. The rope slipped. We had to set our feet hard, or the coffin would have knocked the stone at the head of the next plot." "You remember the coffin?" Maigret said. "Was it heavy?" The sexton scratched at the edge of his cap. "As heavy as most. Not like a child, not like one of those old ones that are light as twigs, 2 men on each rope. We did not hurry it, if that's what you're asking. The widow stood there. She didn't cry like some do with noise and show. She looked as if the rain were falling inside her." "Anyone else notable?" Maigret's tone was mild, almost lazy, but the sexton's eyes flickered. "There was a stranger," he said. "I noticed because men I don't know, I remember them. Tall, a hat pulled low, stood back under the yew as if he didn't belong in the wet with the rest. When we lowered the coffin, he turned his head like this." He showed the gesture, a flinching away that was almost delicate. "I never saw him after." "Can you describe him?" The sexton made a small face, apologetic. "A hat and a coat, Inspector. They make many men look alike." They walked back into the mist, the ledger closed, the names returned to their sleep. Maigret stood again before the mound. He could have asked for the spade and set about the grisly business then and there, but law has its thresholds, and he was not a man to trample them without cause. Yet the thought of the coffin under that earth, the rope burns on the wood perhaps, the nails glinting where the boards met. He felt the shape of it press against his imagination like a presence behind a thin wall. The priest received him in a little parlour that smelled of pipe ash and damp cassock. Père Lenoir was a man whose cheeks had been softened by years of parish wine, and whose eyes were gentle, accustomed to the rhythms of small sorrows. He poured coffee with a hand that shook slightly, and sank into a chair with the weary grace of a man who had carried too many confidences up the chapel steps. "You have read the ledger," he said. "Then you know I did what was required. I said the Mass. I comforted the widow as best I could." "You saw the body?" Maigret asked. The priest made a sign with 2 fingers, not quite a cross. "Only briefly. The doctor had stitched what could be stitched. The face, well, it was not a face as a woman remembers her husband, but death seldom leaves us the luxury of recognition. There was the scar on the wrist. She said he had it from a saw when he was a young man. The hands were a man's hands who had worked with wood. The clothes were his, they told me, though I've never been one for coats and collars." "The doctor's name?" "Gaillard," Père Lenoir said, and there was a note of thinness in his voice at the name, as if speaking it required care. "He has a practice near the square. He's not a bad man. He's a busy one." At Dr. Gaillard's surgery, the smell of disinfectant pressed hard upon the senses, an attempt to scrub away the life that clung to his work. The waiting room was empty. A clock ticked with zeal. When the doctor appeared, he was all quickness and apologetic smiles, a lean fellow with ink on his cuffs and a stethoscope slung like a rope around his neck. "Inspector, you must understand it was 2 years ago, and I have delivered babies and set bones nearly every day since," he said, flipping through a drawer with unnecessary noise until he found a file he may or may not have been looking for. "Accident at the timber yard. A beam slipped. The skull—" He made a brief gesture, a flattening of his hand that suggested both anatomy and avoidance. "I certified. There was no question of foul play raised at the time." "No autopsy," Maigret said. "In Paris, perhaps," Gaillard replied, allowing a smile meant to bridge the distance between provinces and the capital. "Here, when a man who works with heavy wood dies under heavy wood, we seldom summon a pathologist to tell us so. There were witnesses. The widow identified. And, if I may be frank, the town prefers to bury its dead without the trouble of a spectacle. Witnesses, Maigret repeated softly. Their names? The doctor blinked. You will find them in the police report, I'm sure. I merely attend to the body. On leaving, Maigret lingered at the foot of the stairs, his hand on the banister polished by 100 hurried patients. Through the window, he watched a woman hurry by with a child in tow, both their heads wrapped against the mist. Life, he thought, wears its routine like a shawl. Only when you pull at the edge do you see how poorly it truly covers. In the mairie, the clerk, a pale young woman with spectacles and a mouth determined to be exact, produced the burial permit after a brief search. She laid it before him with righteous care. The date of issuance was the 11th, the burial took place on the 12th. The doctor's certificate bore a time of death that had been written with too firm a hand, as if the certainty were required to convince someone not present. The signature at the bottom, Gaillard again, had a flourish more suited to a wedding register than a certificate of death. "Do you find many errors in these documents?" Maigret asked, his tone conversational. "Not errors," the clerk said, bristling slightly. "But sometimes the order of things may be hurried. We are a small staff." "Yes," he said, folding the paper back to her. "And the dead seldom protest." He walked out under a sky that had grown no lighter. Near the edge of town, the timber yard squatted like a rough beast, piles of planks, a sawhouse with a roof of corrugated metal, puddles that reflected the warped shape of the machinery. A thin man with a red scarf watched him approach and put down a hook with slow deliberation as if to show no fear. "You worked here 2 years ago?" Maigret asked. "I still do," the man said, rubbing his palms together. "The wood doesn't change its habits. Coudray worked beside you." "For years." The man's face softened at the name. He was steady. He didn't talk much. He liked to finish a thing before the bell. "How did he die?" The man pointed to a spot near the sawhouse where a plank lay, stained a darker hue than the rest, though the rain had done its best to blur the memory. "We were shifting beams. His foot slipped. The beam rolled, caught him here." He pressed his own temple with 2 fingers. "We lifted it quick. He was breathing and then he wasn't." He swallowed hard, the memory returning to him like a taste. "We sent for the doctor. The widow came later. Anyone strange here that day?" The man shook his head slowly, then stopped. "There was someone by the fence," he said, uncertain now. "A man I didn't know. He watched us, and when I looked again, he was gone. It was a day of rain. Faces blur in the rain." On his way back up toward the churchyard, Maigret paused at a narrow alley that led toward the square. Rain had formed a thin film over the cobbles, a skin the wind pushed into trembling patterns. He thought of the stranger under the yew, the stranger by the fence, both present at the edges where grief and labour met. He thought of the widow's certainty and the priest's careful phrasing and the doctor's tidy papers. Each detail fitted but too neatly, like a suit that sits perfectly on a man you have never seen wear it. Back at the grave he knelt again, heedless now of the damp. With the stem of his pipe he traced his small circle at the edge of the mound where the soil seemed different. The pipe tapped against something that gave, with a dull, fibrous sound. He scraped gently and uncovered a strand of coarse twine, the kind used to bind straw or secure crates. It had been cut with a quick hand and buried shallowly as if in haste. He held it up to the thin light, then let it fall back to the earth. "Twine proves nothing," he told himself. And yet he had seen twine looped in a certain way around coffins when the undertaker was careful to secure the lid against the shifting of the ground. This was not that kind of twine, and it was not where that twine would be. He straightened, his joints complaining. The decision came not like a flash, but like a tide that had been creeping up all morning. He turned toward the sexton, who hovered at a distance with the manner of a man itching to speak and too wise to begin. "Call the commissaire," Maigret said. "We'll need the magistrate as well. I want authority, and an undertaker. We will open it quietly at dusk." The sexton's eyes widened, but he did not argue. Men like him understood that certain knots must be untied in the presence of those who tied them. Dusk found the chapel lit by 2 kerosene lamps whose flames wobbled when anyone moved. The commissaire, nervous moustache twitching, produced the necessary paper with a hand that trembled only a little. The magistrate, a man with a tired dignity, signed after a pause that allowed the moment its gravity. Outside, the air darkened into a velvet damp that swallowed sound. The undertaker arrived with a spade and a face composed into a solemn mask he kept, one suspected for such occasions. They worked with quiet efficiency, the hiss of wet soil sliding from spades, the only persistent sound. Maigret stood a little apart, hands in his pockets, pipe unlit, watching the rectangle deepen. He thought of the widow's folded hands, the priest's shaking fingers, the long ledger line with its sure small letters. He thought of the man who might or might not lie below. When the spades rang softly against the lid, a hush went through them all, the way a church falls silent when the organ ceases mid-note. The undertaker brushed away clinging earth and set his palm flat, feeling the wood as men who work with wood do, reading it with their skin. He looked up once at Maigret, a question without words. The inspector nodded. The iron wrench squealed as it turned the screws one by one, each squeal a thin cry lost to the mist. The lid came free, and the undertaker lifted it gently with help from the sexton. They leaned it against the side of the pit with a caution that was almost tenderness. They peered in. Even from where he stood, even without a lamp lowered for a better look, Maigret knew 2 things at once. The first was the cool exhalation from the open space, the smell of old wood, and the sharp, sour tang of burlap. The second was that the shape within was wrong for a man. It filled the coffin as a man might, but it lacked the softness of limbs and the angles where shoulders meet the neck. It was a clean, hard geometry, wrapped in coarse sacking, the knots tidy, the bulk even. The undertaker swallowed, his throat working. He reached down and tugged at the burlap with 2 fingers. The cloth slipped, revealing not bone, not cloth, but bricks, stacked, mortared in places, tamped to weight. No one spoke. The silence was not reverent now. It was the silence of men who have pulled aside a cloth and found at last the trick. Maigret let out the breath he had not realized he had been holding. He could feel the town beyond the wall, its shutters, its lamps, its gossip, waiting to be fed. He looked at the bricks, at the care someone had taken to make a counterfeit of grief, and he felt neither triumph nor outrage, only the steady, familiar settling of a case shifting into its true shape. He turned to the commissaire. "Close it," he said softly. "For now. No word to anyone, not until I have spoken to the widow." He stepped back from the edge as they set the lid again, the screws turning with a protesting squeal, the earth returning spade by spade to its place as if nothing had been disturbed. Above them, the mist thickened, swallowing their breath. Somewhere in Saint-Aubin, a lamp was being turned down for the night. Somewhere a woman folded her dress over a chair. Somewhere a man checked the latch twice, and in the inspector's mind the figure of the stranger moved, under the yew, by the fence, always at the edge, and the face in the photograph on the sideboard stared without blinking. When the last spadeful fell and the cross stood again at the head, Maigret put on his hat with the care of a man acknowledging a ceremony. The grave had been empty of what it promised, which meant someone had made a promise somewhere else and kept it better than most. He drew a match along the thigh of his trousers and lit his pipe. The flame flared, then settled into a steady glow. He walked down the path without hurry, the glow bobbing gently before his face, and the damp stones underfoot remembered, in their own way, every step that led the living toward the dead and back again. The cafe stood opposite the railway station, a low building with peeling shutters and a striped awning that sagged under the damp. From its doorway one could see the iron rails stretching toward Paris on one side and vanishing into the provincial hills on the other. It was a place where men stopped between trains, where farmers drank before market, where the station hands warmed themselves on cold mornings with rough brandy. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour, sweet odor of wine spilled long ago and rubbed into the wood of the counter. The clock above the bar ticked loudly, its pendulum swinging as though it alone kept the rhythm of the town. Maigret entered, with the heavy tread of a man who did not need to announce himself. The regulars turned, paused, then resumed their talk in lowered tones. The inspector removed his hat, shook the mist from its brim, and found a place at the end of the counter. His greatcoat gave off the smell of damp wool. He ordered a glass of white wine, not because he desired it, but because men who ask questions too quickly are remembered too long. The patronne, a stout woman with hair pinned high and arms reddened from dishwater, set the glass before him and wiped her hands on her apron. She had a voice that carried across the room and an expression that suggested she had little patience for nonsense. "You're the inspector from Paris," she said flatly. Maigret inclined his head. He drew slowly on his pipe, though unlit, as if it were a punctuation mark to thought. "You saw him," he said. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment she looked younger, like a girl caught telling tales. "I did not say I saw him. I said there was a man who looked like him. Same coat, same way of turning his shoulders when he pushed through the door. He walked in, nodded, asked for a glass of red. He drank it quickly, paid exact. Then he left. What did he say? Nothing more than that. But it was the way he placed the coins, 2 francs and a 10-centime piece, neat, like he used to. I've served too many men not to notice how each handles his change. And that gait, Inspector, the way his foot turned slightly out. If it wasn't Francois, then it was the devil borrowing his shoes." From the tables near the window, 2 men shifted uncomfortably. They were railway workers, caps low, faces weathered by smoke and steam. One leaned toward Maigret when the inspector's gaze caught him. "I saw him too," the man said. "Through the smoke it was him. I knew him since we were lads. He had that same notch in his ear where the dog bit him when we were 12. Unless someone went and cut himself the same scar, it was Francois Coudray." His companion shook his head. "You see what you want to see?" he muttered. "I saw a tall man with a coat. Could be anyone. Folks round here want a story more than they want the truth." Maigret listened without comment. He let the contradictions pile up, one voice against another, like timbers stacked in a yard. It was not the words themselves, but the way they were spoken that told him what mattered. The certainty of the patron, the pride of the railway man, the hesitation of his companion, each carried its own weight. He finished his wine slowly, watching the station clock through the cafe window. A train approached with a low rumble, its whistle long and melancholy. The glasses on the shelves rattled. The men at the counter raised their voices to be heard. When the noise subsided, Maigret spoke again. "Did anyone follow him?" The patron hesitated. No one dared. When a man walks out of his grave, you don't chase him down the street, you let him go. The inspector's eyes moved from face to face. Not one of them met his gaze for long. They had seen, or thought they had seen, but none had the courage to press close. Perhaps it was fear of the dead, or perhaps of the living. When he stepped outside, the drizzle had thickened again. He stood beneath the awning and lit his pipe at last, drawing deeply until the glow steadied. Across the street, the station lamps glistened on the wet rails. A train was just leaving, its carriages sliding past, with windows lit, each frame offering a brief glimpse of strangers carried elsewhere. Maigret imagined François Coudray among them, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the dark beyond, vanishing again as silently as he had returned. The commissaire joined him there, fussing with his moustache, his breath visible in the chill. "You see, Inspector, they swear it was him, and yet the grave—" He left the sentence unfinished. Maigret exhaled smoke into the damp air. "The grave was filled with bricks, which means someone intended this from the beginning. The sighting here may be truth or it may be theatre. I need to know which." They walked together along the trackside, their boots squelching in the mud. Beyond the last lamp, the darkness pressed close. Maigret paused, crouched, and examined the ground. A set of prints led away toward the fields. The commissaire bent low with him, but Maigret only shook his head. "Too many boots here, too much rain. The earth tells us nothing tonight." Back at the inn, Maigret sat long over his supper, the lamp flickering as draughts slid under the door. He let the taste of the wine linger, his pipe between his teeth. In his mind, he replayed the scene as they had described it. The door opening, the nod, the glass raised, the coins left on the counter. A gesture so ordinary, so exact, that it might be true. Yet perhaps that was its flaw. Life seldom arranges itself with such neatness. He thought of the widow again, her steady gaze, her insistence that her husband was dead. If the man in the café was indeed François, then she had lived 2 years with a lie buried at her sideboard in a black frame. If it was not François, then someone had gone to great effort to imitate him. Which was worse? The clock in the hallway struck 11. Outside, the trains groaned in the night, their whistles carrying across the mist. Somewhere beyond the square, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Maigret tamped his pipe, leaned back and let the smoke drift ceilingward. The case was no longer merely a curiosity. It was becoming a knot of grief, deceit and theatre, tied somewhere between a coffin of bricks and a glass of red wine in a café by the tracks. He closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to see more clearly. And behind his eyelids he saw again the figure described, the man with the scarred ear, the notch that no imitation could easily forge. If that detail were true, then Saint-Aubin had buried not a man, but a bundle of bricks while François Coudray walked freely among them. And if that was so, Maigret thought grimly, then the true story of his disappearance and of his return had only just begun to reveal itself. Back in Paris, the corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres felt heavier after Saint-Aubin, as if the fog from that provincial town had seeped into the very stones of the police headquarters. Maigret returned without fanfare, his broad figure moving slowly up the stairs, the weight of the case pressing against him in ways not yet articulate. He sat at his desk, pipe unlit, staring at the telegram that had started it all, now smudged at the fold from being handled too often. A man declared dead, buried with ceremony, and yet seen alive. a coffin filled not with flesh and bone, but with bricks. It was not merely a puzzle, it was a calculated act, and Maigret knew calculations always left traces. He summoned Janvier that morning, the younger inspector, eager, sharp-eyed, his notebook already poised. There was something about Janvier's earnestness that Maigret appreciated. He had a way of running errands with loyalty, yet he never forgot that people lied, and papers lied too. "You'll go back through Coudray's life," Maigret said, his voice gravelly, from a night with little sleep. "Everywhere his name appears, contracts, debts, insurance. Quietly, no noise, no theatre. Find who gained from his death, who lost, who was relieved. Talk to clerks, to insurance men, to anyone who stamped a paper in his name. You'll see how neat or messy his affairs truly were." Janvier nodded, scribbling notes. "You think the bricks were planted to hide a fraud?" Maigret gave him a heavy-lidded look. "I think the dead man left debts or treasures behind him. People do not bury bricks for nothing." The errand began at the insurance office on the Boulevard Haussmann, a grand building of marble pillars and brass fittings that tried too hard to disguise its essence, a house built on the fear of death. Janvier, with his respectful smile and careful questions, found the clerk eager to talk once the inspector's card was discreetly shown. The file of François Coudray was produced, the pages neat, the handwriting precise. 2 policies had been paid, one modest sum to the widow, enough to keep her in comfort without ostentation. Another, larger, had gone not to her, but to a business partner whose name was underlined in the register, Henri Marchand. The payout had been substantial, the clerk noted, and the claim processed with unusual speed. The doctor's certificate had arrived the very morning after the death, the burial permit immediately after. There had been no dispute. "Marchand?" Janvier repeated, making the clerk spell it out. "A furniture concern," the man said. "They dealt in timber. Coudray was insured because he worked with dangerous tools. They were partners, you see, though the papers call it a small enterprise. He left behind no children, only his wife, so the policies were simple. One for her, one for the firm." From there, Janvier traced the thread through the greying labyrinth of Parisian commerce. The furniture concern existed, yes, in a small workshop off Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine, but its shutters were drawn, the paint flaking. Inside, dust had settled over abandoned planks. The concierge in the next building told him Marchand had closed it within a year of Coudray's death. He had sold off the stock, pocketed what he could, and vanished. Some said he had gone south to Marseille, chasing new ventures. Others whispered he had taken a mistress and lived well on the insurance until it thinned. Janvier returned to report this to Maigret, who listened with his usual stillness, pipe smoke clouding the office. "Marchand," the inspector repeated softly as though tasting the name. "A partner, a man who profited from the funeral." "Should I try to find him?" Janvier asked. Maigret nodded once. "But carefully. A man who disappears after collecting money does not always wish to be found. See if he left papers behind, leases, contracts, any trace of haste, and speak again to the widow. Ask what dealings her husband truly had with Marchand. Do not press her, just let her talk. She may reveal more when she thinks she is only remembering." While Janvier followed these lines, Maigret himself revisited the files of the timber yard, sending Lucas to question labourers in Paris who once bought their wood from Saint-Aubin. It emerged that Coudray had been well regarded as a worker, steady, dependable, not one for debts of drink or gambling. Yet, quietly, like a stain spreading through cloth, other remark appeared. A quarrel once heard between Coudray and Marchand over the sale of a shipment. A whisper that Coudray had spoken of pulling out of the partnership. The suggestion that he had written letters to a cousin in Rouen about starting anew. Each fragment was slight, but together they formed an outline, a man restless with his lot, tied to a partner who handled money with a loose hand, insured against death in a way that would benefit both wife and business associate. Then a sudden accident, a coffin lowered, and within it bricks in place of flesh. Late one evening, Janvier returned with fresh notes, his face flushed with the satisfaction of discovery. Marchand kept an account at a small bank on Rue de Rennes. I spoke to the manager. Marchand withdrew most of the insurance within days of receiving it. He paid off a few small debts, then vanished. No forwarding address, no inquiries. The manager assumed he'd left Paris for good. "And the widow?" Maigret asked. She admitted Marchand came to see her after the funeral. He pressed her to sign certain papers, final settlements of the business. She said she hardly understood them, but she signed. He was eager, insistent, as if afraid she might change her mind. Maigret's brow furrowed beneath the brim of his hat, which he had not removed, though they sat indoors. And she did not suspect? She said she was numb from grief, that she thought only of surviving. She remembers Marchand sweating, his hands trembling when he held out the pen. But she thought little of it then. Only later did she wonder. The inspector let his pipe go out, staring at the darkened bowl. He imagined the widow at her table, her hands folded, her eyes unwavering. She had been certain her husband was dead. Yet around her swirled men who acted with the haste of guilt. If she was innocent, then she was also the victim of an elaborate deceit. If she was complicit, her calm had been perfected by practice. "Find Marchand," Maigret said again, this time with the tone of a command that admitted no delay. Janvier set about his errand with the doggedness of youth. He spoke to innkeepers, checked passenger lists, sought rumours in cafes near the Gare de Lyon. A man like Marchand leaves ripples behind him, a bill unpaid, a suitcase remembered, a woman who keeps his photograph too long. And indeed, in a modest hotel near the Bastille, an old concierge recalled a guest who had stayed briefly nervous, carrying bundles of cash. He had spoken of Marseille, yes, but his letters addressed in a careless scrawl had gone not south, but east, toward Strasbourg. The trail was thin, but it was a beginning. Maigret heard it with his heavy nod, the smoke curling above him. He felt the case turning, widening beyond Saint-Aubin, beyond the churchyard and the café by the tracks. A man declared dead had returned. Another man had vanished with the money of the dead. The two might be shadows of one another, or accomplices, or adversaries bound by a trick with bricks. That night, as Maigret walked slowly home through the Paris streets, the lamps shining yellow in the mist, he thought of Janvier's errand and the faint path it opened. He imagined Marchand at a table in a distant café, his face drawn, his fingers restless over coins ill-gotten. He imagined François Coudray alive, scarred ear, visible beneath his hat, ordering wine in the same careful way. And between them stood the widow, silent, waiting, her dignity intact, her truth still concealed. He lit his pipe and watched the smoke dissolve in the cool night air. The case was far from its centre. The grave had been emptied, but the emptiness spoke louder than a corpse. Somewhere out there, in the wide map of France, lay the reason a man had chosen to walk out of his own funeral. On the edge of Saint-Aubin, where the cobbled streets gave way to muddy tracks and hedges grown wild, there stood a house that seemed to crouch against the earth as though ashamed of its own walls. Its shutters had been closed for months, perhaps years, their paint blistered, the slats warped, so that damp wind whistled through them in mournful tones at night. Ivy had crawled up the facade, swallowing half the upper windows, and the garden gate sagged on one hinge, squealing whenever touched. Children of the town hurried past it after dusk, whispering that ghosts lived there, or worse, men who were not quite dead. It was toward this house that Maigret walked one grey afternoon, guided by the commissaire's cautious remarks. The locals had long suspected that Coudray, if he were anywhere, had some tie to the place. It had once belonged to an uncle, then passed to cousins who moved to Paris. For years it stood vacant, occasionally rented to seasonal workers who left behind cigarette stubs and broken bottles. Now, though, a neighbour had sworn to hearing noises, footsteps at odd hours, the strike of a match, the faint smell of kerosene carried by the wind. The inspector approached slowly, his boots sinking into the damp earth of the path. Smoke from his pipe mingled with the faint tang of mildew that emanated from the walls. He paused at the gate, studying the shuttered windows. Silence pressed in, but not the silence of abandonment. It was the kind of hush that comes when someone inside holds their breath, waiting. With the commissaire trailing nervously, Maigret pushed the gate. It squealed, the sound loud in the emptiness. He crossed the threshold and stood before the door. It yielded too easily under his hand, as though the lock had not been turned in earnest. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, but beneath it lingered something sharper, the acrid scent of a lamp recently extinguished, the ghost of smoke that clung stubbornly to the rafters. The front room was nearly bare. A table stood in one corner, a chair beside it. On the table lay a matchbox, one match missing, the head still smudged against the striker. A kerosene lamp sat nearby, its wick blackened from recent use. Dust lay on the floor. Yes, but it was broken by the marks of feet, some large, some smaller, crossing the room in hasty lines. Maigret crouched, running a finger along one of the tracks. It was not old. He pressed the dust between thumb and forefinger. Someone had been here within the week, perhaps within the day. He rose, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and moved to the window. Pulling back one warped shutter, he allowed a slant of pale light to pierce the gloom. The beam fell across the mantel, where an empty glass stood. Its rim bore the faint print of lips. The commissaire shifted behind him. "Perhaps vagrants," he said, his moustache twitching. Maigret did not answer. He stepped into the next room, smaller, with a bed against the wall. The mattress was thin, sagging, but the indentation of a body remained, the sheets rumpled. At the foot stood a pair of muddy boots, soles worn thin. On a chair, a jacket was draped, its sleeve frayed at the cuff. He lifted it, sniffed it. The smell was of damp wool and tobacco, Gauloise's if he was not mistaken. A working man's coat, not new, not discarded. He searched the pockets. A few coins, 2 francs and some centimes, a folded scrap of paper with numbers scrawled hastily, figures perhaps, or dates. He slipped it into his own pocket and continued. On the window-sill lay a stub of candle, burned to the quick. Its wax had run in rivulets, solidified into pale tears that clung to the wood. The commissaire hovered uneasily. "Inspector, do you believe—" "I believe," Maigret interrupted softly, "that a man lived here recently, in haste. He did not wish to be seen, but he did not wish to leave entirely. He used this house as a refuge, perhaps as a waiting room. For what? We will see." They climbed the narrow stairs, the banister sticky with age. The upper rooms were emptier still, the shutters nailed shut. Yet even there Maigret found traces. A cigarette butt pressed flat on the floorboards. The faint scent of pipe smoke, not his own, lingering in the wood. A bottle of cheap brandy, nearly empty, cork replaced with a scrap of rag. At the back of the house, a door led to the garden. Weeds grew waist-high, nettles tangling in dense knots. Yet through them Maigret noticed a path, faint but certain, trodden down by repeated steps. He followed it to the wall where bricks had been loosened, creating a narrow passage out to the field beyond. Someone had used it often enough that the mortar crumbled easily under his touch. Standing there, Maigret felt the case breathe against him. A coffin of bricks, a man seen in a cafe, and now a house with shuttered windows that bore the unmistakable signs of habitation. It was no ghost who walked these rooms. It was a man of flesh, careful, cautious, but not invisible. He and the commissaire returned to the square as evening settled. The inn lamps glowed, and townsfolk moved with their usual deliberate gait, yet Maigret felt their eyes follow him more openly now. Rumours travelled quickly in small places, and already they guessed the inspector had found something. He offered them no expression. His heavy face remained impassive, pipe clenched between his teeth, as though he carried nothing more than the day's weariness. At the inn, he spread the scrap of paper on the table under the lamp. The figures meant little at first glance. 2.15-4:37:05. They might have been times, they might have been train departures. He glanced at the timetable pinned near the station entrance earlier that day. Yes, the numbers matched certain departures, Paris, Rouen, Caen. If the man in the house was indeed Coudray, he was watching the trains, perhaps timing them, perhaps waiting for the right moment to leave or for someone arriving. Later that night, as the rain rattled softly against the shutters of his room, Maigret sat with his pipe and thought of the jacket, the glass, the match, the path through the nettles. He thought of the man who lived between two worlds, declared dead, yet alive enough to drink, to smoke, to sleep in a shuttered room. Why return at all if he wished only to vanish? Why risk the eyes of the café, the whispers of the town, unless there was something unfinished, some tether still binding him to this soil? The widow's calm face returned to him, her certainty like stone. If she truly believed her husband was dead, then she was as much a victim of this play as the villagers. But if she knew, if she had met him in that shuttered house, if those steady eyes concealed complicity, then she was stronger than he had imagined. Maigret rose at last, tamped his pipe, and set his hat on the chair beside the bed. He lay down heavily, his boots left by the door, the smell of tobacco still in his beard. Sleep came slowly, broken by the sound of trains in the distance, their whistles carrying through the mist. Each time he half dreamed of footsteps in the house with shuttered windows, of a match struck in the dark, of a man waiting for dawn. When morning came, pale and damp, Maigret knew his next step. He would let the house rest for now, silent in its secrecy. Instead, he would widen the circle. If Coudray had returned, he had not returned alone. Marchand's name still lingered like smoke in the air, and Paris would not conceal him forever. The widow would not be the only one asked to face the truth. For now, though, the house stood empty once more, its shutters drawn, its secret sealed behind the dust. But Maigret knew it was not finished. Houses like that never sleep for long. By the time Maigret returned to Paris, the newspapers had already seized upon the whispers from Saint-Aubin. What had begun as gossip in a provincial café now unfurled across the city in bold black type, as though resurrection itself had stepped off a train and into the morning edition. He saw it first at a kiosk along the boulevard Saint-Michel, where the damp pages hung in neat rows, headlines gleaming under the drizzle. L'homme du tombeau revu vivant, the sheet declared, the letters fat with urgency. A crowd of students clustered around, laughing, tossing coins, folding copies under their arms to read aloud in cafes. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the effect was immediate. Clerks shuffled past carrying papers, constables muttered in corners, and in the courtyard reporters pressed close against the gates, shouting questions at anyone in uniform. Maigret pushed through them heavily, his hat low, his pipe clenched between his teeth. He did not so much ignore them as absorb their questions into silence, for silence was often the best shield. In his office, a stack of clippings already awaited him, placed there by Lucas. Each paper had spun the story differently. One called it a miracle, another a fraud. Some spoke of clerical errors, others of government conspiracies. A few, with less restraint, hinted at dark rituals, bodies exchanged, coffins filled with stone to mock the church. A sketch artist had even drawn a man climbing from a grave, his face shadowed, his widow screaming behind her veil. Maigret read them slowly, his broad fingers smoothing the edges of the newsprint. He knew well enough how swiftly rumour turned to truth once ink gave it permanence. Facts that were never uttered in Saint-Aubin now lived in the pages as though witnessed. One paper claimed the widow herself had fainted at the sight of her resurrected husband. Another insisted villagers had heard his voice calling in the night. Lies, all of them, yet more dangerous than silence. When Janvier entered with fresh notes from his search for Marchand, Maigret simply gestured toward the clippings. "We no longer chase a rumor in a small town," he said quietly. "We chase a scandal that Paris itself wishes to devour." Janvier frowned, pulling off his gloves. "Do you think Marchand leaked it? To cover his tracks? Or to distract us?" Maigret murmured. He tapped the pipe against the ashtray, eyes narrowed at the sketch of the man rising from his coffin. "But the press does not need a hand to fan its fire. It will do so gladly for sales." That evening he walked through the Quartier Latin, his heavy coat brushing against the shoulders of students who carried the papers rolled in their fists. He heard the story retold in every tone, mockery or drunken humour. At a corner cafe, a poet declared to his companions that France had buried itself in lies, and now the dead came back to accuse her. Across the river, in a darker tavern, men muttered that insurance fraud had reached such proportions that even the dead conspired with the living. The city breathed rumour as if it were smoke, filling every lung, every thought. And Maigret, moving through it, felt the case slipping from his grasp, from the quiet precision of witness and grave into the untamable chaos of spectacle. Back at the quay, a letter waited on his desk. The handwriting was bold, uneven, written in haste. It bore no signature, only the initials FC. The message was brief. "They will not let me live. They will not let me die. Meet me where the river bends below the iron bridge. At midnight." Maigret read it twice, then a third time. The initials could be anyone's invention, a trick, a journalist's ploy. Yet the tone was not theatrical. It carried the weight of a man pressed between desperation and defiance. He folded it carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and said nothing of it to the others. Some messages required solitude. He spent the next day in quiet observation, moving among the offices of the insurance company, the mairie, the undertaker's records. Everywhere, clerks eyed him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, their whispers following him after he left. The rumour of Coudray's return had made each document suspect, each signature a potential forgery. What had once been routine transactions now looked like links in a chain of deception. By evening, Maigret found himself once more along the Seine, near the black silhouette of the iron bridge. Fog clung to the water, yellow lamps haloed by the mist. He lit his pipe and waited, his bulk motionless against the rail, the river sliding beneath him with its usual indifference. Time stretched, footsteps echoed, paused, then vanished. Rats skittered along the embankment, a barge horn moaned upriver. Midnight came and passed. At last a figure appeared in the fog, hesitant, coat collar high. Maigret did not move. The man lingered at a distance, half concealed, then turned and slipped back into the mist without a word. Only the echo of his steps remained, growing fainter until the night swallowed them. Maigret stood there long after, pipe cold between his teeth. He knew well enough the ways of men who feared to be seen. Perhaps it was Coudray, perhaps only one more phantom conjured by rumour. But the letter in his pocket felt heavier now, its plea unresolved. The following morning the papers screamed louder still. "Inspector meets the dead man at midnight," declared one headline, though Maigret had spoken to no journalist and the meeting had yielded only silence. Someone had followed him or else guessed his movements. The story had slipped entirely beyond his control. Within the quay, the atmosphere grew tense. The prefect summoned him, his words measured but edged with displeasure. "These newspapers make a circus of us, Maigret. You are a servant of the law, not of mystery novels. Bring me facts, a body, a confession, or this case will consume us all." Maigret left the office with a grim set to his jaw. He felt the weight not only of the prefect's demand, but of the widow's dignity, the townspeople's whispers, the frightened footsteps at the bridge. Rumour had become a tide, and against it stood only the slow, stubborn patience of one man determined to find truth in a world that preferred stories. That night, alone at his kitchen table, Madame Maigret setting a quiet plate before him, he said little. He ate slowly, pipe waiting beside his glass. When at last he lit it, he exhaled a plume of smoke and stared into it as though the answer might emerge there. "They make him alive in the papers," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "But in truth, he is still between worlds. Until I see him, speak to him, he is neither." And so, with the press roaring louder each morning, Maigret prepared himself for the next step. If rumour would not bring him the man, then money might. The insurance, the vanished partner Marchand, the tidy sums that had changed hands, these were not phantoms. They left trails, signatures, debts. And in those trails he would find the living man behind the coffin of bricks. The world of insurance, Maigret often thought, was a theatre of shadows, men in stiff collars, clerks with precise handwriting, documents that seemed solid until one asked who had signed them and why. Behind each contract lurked the possibility of gain, and behind each gain the whisper of fraud. Now, as he sat in the oak-panelled office of a director on the Boulevard Haussmann, he felt the weight of that theatre pressing in. The room smelled faintly of polish and stale cigars, the curtains heavy enough to block out the drizzle on the boulevard below. The director, a man with a pointed beard and narrow eyes, laid a file on the desk with deliberate care. He spoke as though each word were being weighed in the scales of commerce. "The Coudray case, Inspector. We paid out 2 policies. One modest sum to the widow, 8,000 francs, another 30,000 to his partner, Henri Marchand. Both were supported by a doctor's certificate, a burial permit, and the signatures of local authorities. We acted in good faith." Maigret let the man's voice settle into the air like dust. He drew slowly on his pipe, unlit, rolling the stem between his teeth. 8,000, he murmured, enough to keep a widow clothed and fed. 30,000, enough to change a man's life. The director adjusted his spectacles, lips thin. "Precisely why we ensured everything was in order. But if your inquiries prove that the man is alive, we shall expect restitution. Fraud of this scale would, how shall I put it, darken the trust the public places in us. Maigret gave no answer. He had heard the same tone in 100 officials, the tone of men more concerned with reputation than truth. He carried the file away, its papers rustling faintly, and spent the afternoon leafing through it at his desk. Certificates, signatures, policies, each one appeared in proper sequence. Yet there was something too smooth about them, as though the lines had been rehearsed in advance. Janvier, returning from another fruitless search for Marchand, leaned against the window, rain dripping from his coat. "He's vanished like smoke, Petrol. Every lead dies after a few."
"Streets! If he took that money, he knew where to hide." Maigret grunted. He held up the widow's policy in one hand, Marchand's in the other. One was paid without question. The other was rushed. Look, the claim was filed the very day after the burial. Too swift, too eager. He thought again of the widow's steady eyes, her quiet insistence. She had not looked like a woman enriched by fraud. Yet Marchand, sweating, trembling, pressing papers into her hands, his image lingered. 30,000 francs was not a sum a careless man left untouched. The following morning, Maigret walked to the Palais de Justice, the file under his arm. He requested access to notarial records, contracts, business agreements. In the dim, dust-scented archive, clerks fetched volumes bound in leather, their pages brittle at the edges. There he found the partnership contract between Coudray and Marchand, a modest enterprise, equal shares, profits divided. But tucked among the clauses was one detail that caught his eye. In the event of death, Marchand retained the right to claim a substantial payout, far more than his contribution warranted. Maigret stared at the line, the ink still sharp, though years had passed. It was not unusual, not illegal. Yet it carried the smell of calculation. A man like Marchand, loose with money, would see death not only as loss but as opportunity. And if that death could be arranged or feigned, the opportunity became a certainty. In the evening he returned to Saint-Aubin, rain striking against the train windows, his reflection staring back at him in blurred fragments. The widow received him again, her house dim, the crucifix above the mantel casting a narrow shadow. She poured coffee without a word. "Madame," he said, his voice low, "did your husband ever speak of ending the partnership with Marchand?" Her eyes flickered, the first crack in her composure. She hesitated before answering. He spoke once of leaving, of finding work in Rouen, perhaps. He said Marchand was careless, that money disappeared too quickly. But it was only words, Inspector. A man grumbles, he never left. Did he speak of insurance? She looked at him sharply now, as though gauging his intention. Only that it was necessary in dangerous work. He did not dwell on it. He watched her carefully, the lamplight glinting in her eyes. She seemed honest, yet in her silence there was something withheld. Not lies, perhaps, but a truth too heavy to place on the table. Later that night, Maigret walked past the churchyard again. The grave lay as before, its cross silent, the earth smooth once more. Yet beneath it still lingered the memory of bricks, of deceit so calculated it required not only hands to stack them, but minds to design them. Insurance, he thought, was less about death than about opportunity. And in opportunity lay greed. The press, meanwhile, grew feverish. Headlines accused the insurance companies of negligence, of feeding fraud,
through their own haste. Columnists demanded inquiries, trials, punishments. Rumour now painted Marchand as a conspirator with the widow, or else with the man himself. Some papers even suggested Maigret was complicit, protecting a phantom for reasons unknown. He read these with his usual impassivity, but the weight of expectation pressed harder. At the quay, Lucas brought him word of a notary's assistant who had remembered Marchand. He came often, the assistant recalled, nervous, asking about procedures. He wanted to know how quickly money could be released, how signatures could be confirmed. He asked about travel papers too, though he never filed them. Marchand again, always Marchand, circling like a shadow just beyond reach. One afternoon, as Maigret sat at his desk with the file open before him, a telegram arrived. The clerk handed it in with a glance that betrayed curiosity. Maigret opened it with deliberate calm. The words were few, the message unsigned. "You look for Marchand. Look instead to the river. Papers do not drown, but men do." He read it twice, pipe unlit, then folded it into his pocket. It was both warning and taunt. Perhaps Marchand had vanished into water, leaving only the echo of his fraud. Or perhaps someone wanted the inspector to believe so. That evening he walked along the Seine, near Saint-Aubin, where barges drifted slow under the weight of mist. The water lapped against stone steps slick with algae, indifferent to the affairs of men. He stood there a long while, pipe smoke curling around him, considering the telegram. Insurance, fraud, death, disappearance, all flowed like the river, carrying fragments downstream until they lodged somewhere unexpected. As he turned back toward the inn, he felt the case shifting again. The widow with her calm eyes, the house with its shuttered windows, the cafe where men swore they saw the dead, all these were not separate. They were threads knotted around the weight of money. 30,000 francs had been enough to bury a man alive, enough to fill a coffin with bricks, enough to send one partner vanishing and another walking out of his own grave. And in that shadow of insurance, Maigret knew, the truth waited still. Not in the headlines, not in the rumours, but in the quiet corners of ledgers and the fear in men's eyes when they spoke too quickly of death. The Seine at night carried a different voice. By day it was a murmur, barges groaning as they slid past, the chatter of gulls circling over wet stone. But at midnight, under the weight of fog, it whispered in tones only the sleepless could hear. Maigret stood near the bridge outside Saint-Aubin, his heavy coat buttoned against the chill, the glow of his pipe faint against the mist. The telegram that had arrived 2 days before, unsigned, warning him to look to the river, still pressed against the lining of his pocket. The bridge itself was old iron, its arches broad, its lamps dulled by the damp. Below, the water slid black and slow, carrying occasional scraps of driftwood that bumped softly against the stone piers. Footsteps echoed faintly along the deserted embankment. Each sound arrived stretched, as though the fog bent it. Maigret had chosen this spot not out of obedience to the message, but because instinct told him the case had circled back here. The widow's certainty, the bricks in the coffin, Marchand's vanished figure, each pointed toward a reckoning, and reckoning often sought the river. He leaned his elbows on the rail, puffing slowly, eyes narrowed against the night. It was near 1 o'clock when he heard it, a shuffle behind him, hesitant, the sound of boots sliding against damp stone. He did not turn immediately. Instead, he let the rhythm approach, then stop. Silence. Then the scrape of a match, the flare of a cigarette, a faint glow that revealed little but hesitation. "You came," Maigret said, his voice steady, almost conversational. The figure stood half-shrouded in mist, hat brim low, collar high. The glow of the cigarette rose, fell. "I shouldn't have," the man muttered. His voice was low, hoarse, the words carried more by fear than by strength. "Coudray," Maigret said, not a question, but a weight dropped into the air. The man flinched, though he did not step forward. "They said you'd find me. They said you always do." Who said? The man gave a short, bitter laugh that was more like a cough. Marchand. Before he ran. He told me you'd never leave a coffin of bricks in peace. He said the inspector would come sniffing like a dog until the truth was hauled out. He was right. The fog thickened around them. Maigret drew on his pipe, letting the silence settle. At last he spoke again. Why bricks? Because a coffin must weigh something, the man said simply. Because men feel better lowering weight into the earth. Because it fools the hands as much as the eyes. It was Marchand's idea, he said, with his papers, with the doctor's signature, with the priest's blessing. The town would not ask questions, and they didn't. And you? I was tired of being François Coudray, the man whispered. Tired of debts, of timber that cut into my hands, of a wife who looked through me as if I were already fading. Marchand promised freedom. He promised that once the money came, we'd leave, start again. He took his share, I would take mine later. Only later never came. He stepped closer now, enough that Maigret could see the outline of his face, the scar on the ear, the hollow of his cheeks, the tremor in his hands. He was alive, yes, but with the look of a man who had been walking with ghosts too long. Why return? Maigret asked softly. Why come back to the cafe, to the house with shuttered windows? Why let yourself be seen? Because he betrayed me, the man said fiercely, the words breaking out of him. Marchand took the 30,000 and vanished. He left me with nothing but a grave filled with bricks. I had hidden in the house, waiting, thinking he would send word. He never did. I came back because I wanted to be seen, because I wanted him to know I still walked, that his trick had not buried me. But all I found was fear. The widow's eyes, the whispers in the square, the newspapers, they all saw me as something I wasn't, a ghost, a fraud, a man neither alive nor dead. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his heel. The ember hissed against the damp stone. I thought the river would take me. I thought perhaps the Seine would finish what Marchand began, but even the river spat me out. I have nowhere. Maigret listened, his broad face unreadable. He felt the man's desperation, the hollow echo of his choices. Yet he knew there were still lies tangled in the story. The widow? He said. Did she know? The man shook his head violently. She believed it. She buried me. She wept, though not loudly. Marchand told her only what she needed to sign. She thought me dead, Inspector. If she has looked at me since, it was only in memory. The fog swirled, carrying the smell of wet iron and river mud. Maigret leaned heavier on the rail. And Marchand? Where is he now? I don't know, Coudray whispered. He said Marseille. Others said Strasbourg. He told me once that men vanish best in places with ports, where ships forget names. He promised he would send for me when it was safe. He lied. The inspector studied him. The scarred ear, the hollow eyes, the tremor in his voice, all matched the accounts. And yet, was this man confessing or rehearsing? Truth and deceit often spoke with the same cadence when despair guided them. Come with me, Maigret said at last, his tone not harsh but inevitable. The quay will not bury you again, but it will listen. You cannot walk between grave and street forever. The man shook his head. If I step into your office, I am dead all over again. The law will not forgive. The papers will devour me. The widow will despise me. Better the river. He turned suddenly toward the rail. For a moment Maigret thought he would leap, but the inspector's hand shot out, broad and firm, catching his sleeve. Their eyes met, one steady, one frantic. You've chosen once to bury yourself, Maigret said quietly. Do not choose again. The river swallows truth. I want truth. The man sagged, the strength draining out of him. He leaned against the rail, head bowed, breathing heavily. "Then take me," he murmured. "But know that Marchand is the one who profited. Find him. If you want the truth, find him." Maigret nodded once. He did not release the man until the tension eased, until the desperate pull toward the water had passed. Together they walked slowly along the embankment, their footsteps echoing on the stone. Above them the lamps flickered faintly, and below the river slid on, indifferent as ever. When dawn came, pale and cold, Maigret sat in his office once more, the man called François Coudray seated across from him. He gave his statement in a low, steady voice, each word falling like a stone into the inspector's notes. He admitted to the bricks, to the plan, to Marchand's promises. He denied the widow's knowledge. He confessed to nothing violent, only to complicity born of despair. Outside, the city stirred, the presses clattered, the fog lifted. Rumour would twist the story anew, by noon, no doubt. But for Maigret the path had narrowed. Marchand remained the shadow behind it all, the man who had profited, who had vanished with 30,000 francs, leaving a partner to haunt his own grave. As Coudray was led away, Maigret lit his pipe and watched the smoke drift upward, dissolving into nothing. The case was not over, it had only sharpened. The man had chosen not to drown, not yet. But somewhere under another bridge, in another town, Marchand might still be waiting or hiding. And Maigret knew that before the story ended, the river would demand another midnight. Paris woke slowly that morning, shutters creaking open one by one, milk carts rattling along wet cobbles, the faint aroma of roasting beans drifting from cafes. In the inspector's office at the Quai des Orfèvres, the fog still clung to the river below, curling around the barges like a shawl. Maigret sat at his desk, pipe between his teeth, smoke rising in steady plumes. Before him lay the report of François Coudray, signed in a trembling hand, its lines a mixture of confession, denial, and weary justification. The man was alive, yes, but more a ghost of himself than the spectre the newspapers had conjured. He had spoken at length, his words carrying the dull ring of truth. Marchand had designed the fraud, persuaded him to vanish, filled the coffin with bricks. The promise had been freedom, freedom from debts, from the drudgery of timber, from the dull ache of a marriage turned silent. But promises made in desperation sour quickly. Marchand had taken the lion's share of the money and vanished into the labyrinth of France, leaving his partner behind with only the taste of betrayal and the weight of a false death. Maigret turned the pages slowly, listening to the scrape of a chair in the corridor, the clatter of boots on the stairs. The world around him carried on as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, while in truth the very order of death and burial had been mocked. He tapped ash into the tray, leaned back, and closed his eyes for a moment. Behind his lids he saw again the open coffin, bricks stacked with the neatness of a mason, the town standing around in ignorance while the lie was lowered into the earth. Lucas entered with fresh reports. Marchand had not been traced to Marseille, nor Strasbourg. Rumours abounded, sightings in Lyon, whispers in Le Havre, but nothing solid. A man with 30,000 francs could move like water, seeping through cracks, vanishing where eyes did not look. Janvier, still flushed with the zeal of youth, insisted they would find him. "No man can hide forever, patron. He will show himself if only to spend. Money makes men careless." Maigret gave a small grunt of assent, though his heavy features betrayed no optimism. He had seen too many vanishers in his time, men who melted into the folds of Europe, leaving only half-remembered names behind them. Marchand might one day reappear in a port or a brothel, in a gambling hall or a morgue, but for now he was smoke, and it was smoke that drifted in the inspector's office, thickening the air, blurring the edges of the file before him. Madame Maigret arrived with a parcel of food, as she often did when he forgot to eat. She set it quietly on the sideboard, her eyes resting for a moment on the man's confession. "So it was true," she said softly. "It was true enough," Maigret answered. "And the widow?" He thought of her calm gaze, her steady words, the certainty with which she had declared her husband dead. Perhaps she had known nothing. Perhaps she had known and chosen silence. In either case, she had lived 2 years beneath the weight of suspicion, and now she would live the rest of her life under the weight of scandal. Truth never restored what rumor had destroyed. "She will endure," Maigret said at last. "Women like her always do." By noon, the press had already twisted the case into fresh shapes. One sheet painted Coudray as a criminal mastermind who had fooled even the inspector. Another made him a tragic figure, driven by poverty and betrayal. A few declared him innocent, a pawn in Marchand's scheme. Each story carried its own certainty, and none resembled the weary, broken man Maigret had seen at the bridge. The prefect summoned him again, his displeasure cloaked in formality. "You've given them a living man, Inspector, but no trial, no Marchand, no resolution. They will not forgive ambiguity. They demand closure." Maigret listened without protest, his pipe unlit in his pocket. Closure was a word for politicians and editors, not for men who dealt with human frailty. He left the prefect's office with his usual heavy gait, knowing well that the truth seldom tied itself neatly. It frayed at the edges, it slipped through fingers, it left questions behind. That evening he returned briefly to Saint-Aubin, drawn less by duty than by instinct. The town was quieter now, its excitement dulled by the paper's exaggerations. Children still whispered about the ghost of Coudray, but their mothers hushed them, tired of the scandal. At the churchyard, the grave stood as before, the cross weathered, the chrysanthemums bowed. Yet Maigret felt the difference. It was no longer a grave, but a symbol, a stage prop in a play that had fooled them all. The widow passed him in the square, her veil still in place, though the days of mourning were long past. She inclined her head, nothing more. In her eyes was neither gratitude nor anger, only a quiet endurance. He watched her go, her back straight, her steps measured. Whatever she had lost or gained, she would carry it with the same composure as before. On the train back to Paris, Maigret sat in silence, pipe smoke curling against the window. The landscape slid past in shades of grey and brown, fields blurred by mist, stations where porters shouted and dogs barked. He thought of Marchand, of Coudray, of the coffin filled with bricks. He thought of how easily paper and signature had replaced flesh and bone, and how the law itself had been fooled until a rumour broke it open. At dawn, the city stretched itself awake once more. The inspector walked slowly along the quay, watching the river. Barges moved under the pale light, smoke rising from their chimneys. The air was sharp, damp, filled with the scent of stone and water. He drew on his pipe, the glow steady in the morning mist. The case, in its way, was closed. A man declared dead had returned, not triumphant, but hollow, burdened by his own survival. Another man, Marchand, remained a shadow, carrying away the true prophet. The widow endured, the town whispered, the newspapers shouted, and the inspector filed his report with the usual brevity. Yet in Maigret's mind, the story lingered, not for its scandal, nor for its fraud, but for the quiet image of a man walking out of his own funeral into the fog, alive and yet more lost than any corpse. He exhaled smoke into the dawn, watching it dissolve above the river. Cases ended, always. But the lives they touched seldom did. And so the inspector turned back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, his silhouette heavy against the morning light, carrying with him the weight of another mystery laid to rest, or perhaps merely laid aside, while the city stirred and the river whispered on.